power in the ballot box. And the time to be talking about it is now, before the elections ever take place, because those who rig elections, those who corrupt elections, those who want to remain in power, they start their machinery way before elections ever take place. So if Africa wants to win itself, like the case we see in Senegal, Mali, and the rest of the other countries where the youths are rising up to the occasion, the moment is now to start discussing and putting in place what are the hindrances that are hindering the electoral process in Africa. What are the downfalls? What are the pitfalls? What do people need to do? What's the mobilization process? Why are people not registering? All those things need to be discussed way ahead of time before the elections happen, because we talk about the power of the ballot box. If the date of the election comes and you do not have that power, you can talk all your life about the power of the ballot box. As long as you do not exercise that power, it will have meaningless impact as long as democracy is concerned. So this is a very crucial thing. It should be discussed all across Africa, especially this year.
Cameroon has started the voters registration, a mobilization process that is there to sensitize the population for them to be able to take part in the upcoming elections, or rather still go and register, because only through registering that they shall be able to take part in the process. Now, looking at the AU's developmental roadmap, or better still, the Agenda 2063, when you look at this, it states that elections is a role, or a pivotal role, to portray countries' level of democracy. Now, as an expert in the field, how do you assess this? Do you think this is really visible or relevant in all African countries?
No, I do not think so. And I'll give you my view on why I think so. The African Union is not doing what it's supposed to do. The African Union is supposed to put a powerful intercontinental election monitoring body in place if they are really talking about democracy as regards to Agenda 2063. A powerful monitoring body in place that is supposed to work with the individual countries' monitoring organizations and help these countries to really carry out meaningful democracy, but it's not doing that. They'll send one or two representatives and say, this is African Union representative. And they go there and they sit there and they don't do anything. Or if they do anything, they observe the elections in one little town and say everything went well. But that's not where the problem lies. The problem lies right from the beginning of the process. What is the African Union doing when it comes to electoral commissions in those countries? Because that's where the problem starts. If you look at the electoral commissions in the countries, most of them in Africa are stuck with proponents or stalwarts or oligarchs of the ruling party that will definitely rig the elections. Is that democracy? No. What is the African Union's stand on that? They have no stand. Number two, African Union talks about democracy as part of its agenda. If you look at the preamble and look at what most of those countries are doing in terms of voter intimidation, registration intimidation, voter violence, prior, even before the elections. That's what I said. Elections are not rigged on election day. They are rigged way before election day. What is the African Union doing in that? The African Union has no agenda and no plan when it comes to election violence. Look at the African Union preamble on dictatorship. When they came up with an agenda, it was, can't remember the article that they mentioned some time ago. They said, leaders should not change their constitutions in order to run for elections forever. And a lot of the dictators that were in that African Union, they saw that their position were threatened. So they lobbied around and lobbied around. And that article was changed and said, you cannot change your constitution 6 months to an election, which means that they gave them a leeway. They could do it a year before an election and they'll still be eligible. So you see, African Union itself does not have a solid foundation on which to anchor such principles. It becomes a paper tiger document that does not have concrete actions in the ground, because if you do not have any concrete actions in the ground, What you're going to do is just send out communiques outside there, and nothing's going to happen. And then you're going to send one or two representatives that will come back and say the elections were free and fair. Look at what happened in Democratic Republic of Congo. That was a sham. Look at what happened in Central African Republic. That was a sham. And very soon another one's going to happen in Chad, which is going to be a sham. And yet African Union will come back and certify those elections and say they were free and fair, because a lot of the problems that we face with African Union are they write these things on paper, but it's not practical thing in the ground. If you go through the Agenda 2063, whether you pick any of those 17, I can't remember if there's 17 or 19 pillars, you pick one and you go on the ground and you investigate and find out what has been done in terms of concrete action to see that this pillar is already being implemented, or something like breaking the ground has started. You see that zero. All that you see in Agenda 2063 is still on paper. Maybe a committee has met, maybe a committee has not met, maybe they have said about this. So African Union talks, but does not back. There's a lot that is written on paper. When it comes to concrete action, they are still lack. I talk with a lot of the leaders from there, and I always make my point very, very clear that I do not buy the pace at which the African Union is moving. Whether you're talking about democracy or any other pillar that you pick in there, pick one, and I will tell you there's nothing on the ground. So again, I think the African Union needs to do more than sending out communiques or writing preambles or writing pillars or writing things. They need concrete actions on the ground. So when it comes to democracy, that is not enough.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Now, earlier on, you mentioned that elections are one of the pillars of ensuring a country, or testing if a country has a well-functioning democracy, while it measures the political landscape of the said nation. Now, how do you think, or earlier on you said equally that electoral bodies are not equally fulfilling what you're supposed to do. How can we create that balance in such a contemporary society?
An electoral body to give some semblance of fairness. An electoral body should be independent. That's the most important word. Independent. When you do not show any semblance of independence in terms of the constitution of the electoral body, number one, you're undermining the credibility of the election right from the onset, because people are going to ask questions. You have an electoral commission that's constituted, give an example, 10 people, and 6 or 7 or 8 people of that electoral body are members, active members of the party in power. That credibility is already in jeopardy. Number two, you have members of the electoral body that are actively militating in the political parties. I'm not talking about representative of political parties within the electoral body. I'm talking about members of the electoral body that are supposed to be neutral, but they're actively militating most of the time in the ruling party of that country. That tells you that the credibility of that election is in jeopardy, is questioned. Number three, you have an electoral body that does not carry out a massive sensitization campaign of registration of voters. And they just say it. Maybe people don't know what their organization is doing. People don't understand where they need to register. People don't understand the stakes. People don't understand the process. It becomes an opaque process where people don't know what's needed. Do you need an identity card? Do you need a passport? Where do you need to register? Where do you need to get one? What is the deadline for you to get that? That information is not being propagated. Because if you look here in the Western world, before an election comes up, you have the electoral body who will go out in massive campaign, massive campaign, and make sure that everyone can exercise their vote. But when you have this kind of opaque communities, opaque societies, opaque organizations, where people are doing things as if they want to favor a certain political party, you are undermining the credibility of the electoral process. I don't want to go into the economic downside of that, because that's going to be another discussion altogether. Just look at the political organization of what it takes to organize free and fair elections. So those 3 points that I've mentioned, if they are lacking, that electoral body is in question. So African leaders need to understand the implication of this, the downside of this, the risk, apart from the fact that elections are not going to consider fair and just. You have, permit me just mention a few economic downside of this. You have non-governmental organizations, the Bretton Woods institutions, bodies that are lending to Africa, because no country is going to run without lending, borrowing. It's a normal process of running a country. They are looking at those numbers, and they're looking at those elections. They're looking at what's happening in your country. And they are going to rank your country, because everything in the Western world, you live and die by credit. You see people having big houses all on credit. They're running big cars all on credit. And that's how country run. A country is going to go and is going to need borrowing in order to run. And then people will buy bonds and buy, whatever they need to do so that government can raise money. These countries, African countries, when elections are going in, these Bretton Woods institutions or countries that are lending money to Africa, they are watching. When an election is not credible, it's not fair, and it brings about maybe on civil unrest or some other social ills, that country is going to be ranked as a high-risk borrowing country. What that means is that when they go back to those Bretton Woods institutions to borrow money, they are going to give them that money at a very exorbitant interest rate. And therefore, the downside of it is that these African countries are going to spend their time servicing debt and not even developing anything. If you look at the debt-to-service ratio of African countries, just go to the United Nations Development Index and check it. Most countries are between 30, 40, 50%. If you're using 50% of the national budget to service debt, how can Africa develop? So the downside of this is enormous that we cannot, time will fail us to discuss all that. So again, it is to the detriment of the continent of Africa if we have elections that are as soon as not credible, not fair, and then there's election violence that follows, there's chaos that follows, nobody wins.
Of course, let's now get these reports in a bit to understand how the voters' registration process is taking place here in Cameroon before we proceed back to our analysis.
Cameroon is gearing up for the upcoming general elections, billed for 2025, bringing the process closer to the population. The United People Party for Social Renovation, who has as chair Serge Espoir Matomba, has organized a mobilization and sensitization campaign to encourage Cameroonians to vote massively, go and register ahead of the elections come 2025. A process that has turned out effective as the crowd was massive, mass needed to decide the future of Cameroon. According to Mr. Matumba, the ballot box is the only route to change.
The way that our country has been leading today is a problem for many Cameroonians. And the only way to resolve the problem by the moment is election, because we are in a democratic country. So for those things to change, we have to bring people or to encourage people to register. Later, we encourage them to vote. And when they will vote, if we have a massive vote, we will see that our country will change completely.
Mr. Wambangwa Philemon, a civilian who already has his voter's card, shares the same opinion.
In the day 2025, all the youths will go in and vote. So I'm encouraging all the youths to register and go in for elections. So that is all that I can say.
Mr. Vijay Felix, on his part, reiterated that the institutions put in place like ELECAM and political actors need to collaborate for better results.
The ELECAM should improve on its policies, and as the politician, all the other parties are saying, let them try to come together and have one consensus so that everybody should agree to be able to convince the youth that the election will be free and fair. That's the first thing, because youth are just thinking that it will always be the same as it has always been.
As the period unfolds, Cameroonians are encouraged to actively take part in the change process.
Thank you, Buka Marumbi, for that report. So, up to you, Dr. Welaji. You listened to that a compilation done for us by Buka for You Media Africa. But then, here in Cameroon, you earlier on mentioned that a lot needs to be done on the part of the electoral bodies in a bid to ensure that this process actually goes smoothly. Now, the fact that the crowd is actually coming out massively, could we say that the trust in electoral processes across the continent have begun to rise over time?
Yes, I would say that there is a yearning for, I would say that there's a yearning for democracy all across Africa, not just Cameroon. Young people are rising up. You know, if you see what happened in Senegal, that was basically a result of young people who said, enough is enough. Enough is enough. They rose up and they had one of theirs, a 44-year-old young man, to be president. They rose up. If you see what happened in Mali, even though it was not a democratic process, but then it was young people who rose up and said, they don't want that. And Niger and so on, even though it wasn't a democratic process. But again, the point I'm making is that young people, when they rise up, things change in Africa. But if you look at your report, if you look at your report that you just did over there, you realize that those are political actors that are trying to do the work of the electoral body in Cameroon. This is something that the electoral body is supposed to come out strong and make sure that they collaborate. One of them mentioned it. He said there's supposed to be collaboration between the electoral body and the political actors. But when political actors are doing the work of the electoral body, it tells you that there's a problem. It tells you that there's a problem. An electoral body is supposed to collaborate with the political parties for massive voter registration. That's what's supposed to happen. Everybody's supposed to know where to register. Everybody's supposed to know the rules. What does it take? What are the requirements? Where do I supposed to register? Because you have to register and make sure that you vote where you register. And all these things, this is what Africa needs to do in order to improve the democratic process in the country. You cannot allow it to the civilians or the indigenous or the political parties to do the work of an electoral body. No, it's supposed to be an electoral body collaborating with the political actors on the ground or even non-governmental organizations to make sure that there is massive registration and everybody's vote is counted at the end of the day. So your actors, when I listen to them, that tells me that they are channeling the same thing that we are trying to say here, that the electoral body needs to do more than simply existing.
Thank you so much. And now, in your opinion, aside elections, what other sectors can contribute to reshaping a nation's future?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the civil society in Africa, not the whole of Africa, but in most countries in Africa, it's a little bit complacent and less. Why do I say so? The civil society is supposed to act like a catalyst. The civil society, I mean civil actors who are not really much into they are not political parties, neither are they organizations that have a stake. Their stake is just that they want to see free and fair elections in the country. That is the area that's lacking in Africa. Civil society need to work hand in hand with the actors, political actors, non-governmental organizations. They need to come to the table and pressurize, bring pressure to bear to the oligarchs, the people that want to sit tight, people that do not want to release Africa from the fence of poverty. That's what they need to do. So in order for all these sectors to, work together, somebody needs to take the lead. And I've seen, in cases like Cameroon, Senegal, and some other countries, I've seen young people taking the lead. And number two, I think the diaspora. The diaspora has always played a role in terms of good governance in Africa. But unfortunately, what is happening is that a lot of governments in Africa seem to look at diaspora as an enemy. They look at the diaspora as an enemy. But if you look at countries where the diaspora has played a vital role, not just in the elections, but in the economy of the nation as a whole, you will see a difference. Give an example. In Ghana, there was a law that was passed that all diasporas should come back home. Not a law that is forcing them to come back home, but encouraging them to come back home. Not just invest in the economy of their country, but take part in the political process of the country. And you have massive influx of Ghanaians. In fact, when I was doing my postgraduate studies, I had Ghanaian friends, and immediately they finished. They said they were going back home, while some of us were still trying to situate ourselves in the Western world. I said, why are you going back home? He said, well, based on what the economies and their government and their president and their political leaders are doing right now, it will be most feasible and economically advantageous for them to go back home. And as I speak, and I still talk to a lot of them have established businesses back home, things are going so well for them, even more than some of us that are here in the West. A lot of them have become politically active in the political process of their country. A lot of them have become representative of their people in their constituents where they are. Because the government is welcoming the diaspora. They feel that the diaspora is part of the process, part of the development. But a government that is hostile to a diaspora, that tells you that there's a problem. So there are different things that can be put in place and different actors that can come together to see that there is real change in the continent of Africa. I think if Africa follows that path, I think things will change. We've seen that happen in Senegal just recently, just to give an example.
Yeah, exactly. Senegal is a good example of what's happening. Now, you earlier on cited that the diaspora do have a very powerful role to play, but then it encompasses some of the opportunities that the African continent can actually benefit from. Now, casting the vote through the ballot box could lead to an opportunity for a country, especially a country that is undergoing a democratic process. And now with that in mind, when it comes to a nation's growth, developments and stability, how important is the role of the diaspora in ensuring this?
Sharon, if my numbers are correct, the last time I was doing research and I fell across a report that said, I think every year, I don't want to give a wrong number, but it's somewhere around $63.5 billion that enters Africa from the diaspora. $63.5 billion. Imagine that colossal amount of money that is leaving the Western world, entering Africa, and then those people are excluded from the political process of the country. It tells you that something's wrong somewhere. Because if you look at countries that have actually welcomed their diaspora, what happens is that the diaspora works together with a lot of non-governmental organizations and Western organizations to bring about contractual agreements, partnerships, and many other advantages that the country would not be able to enter into. I'll give you another example. We talked about Senegal a while ago. If you know the musician called Akon, he's of Senegalese ancestry. He's an American citizen, no doubt about that. But he's of Senegalese ancestry. If you know what he is doing in Senegal, Akon is transforming Senegal. Many people are not aware of it. He has built cities. He has constructed roads. He's not just doing it with his money alone. He has aligned himself with a lot of organizations in the United States, both non-governmental, parastatals, private, NGOs, investors, and so on. And they are streaming into Senegal because they believe in him. They see what he is doing there. And he's selling an image of the country to the Western world in such a way that before people start dealing with Senegal, they go to him. They ask him for data. He works with a lot of organizations like mine, and they give him data, give him information, give him research data, they give him a lot of feasibility studies of what it takes to invest in business A or business C or business D. And these people now go into the country and confirm that data, and they invest in the country. So the diaspora is not just there to send money back home. the diaspora can contribute immensely in the development of the country. Number two, I mentioned Ghana a while ago, before mentioning Senegal, because these case studies, sometimes when I speak, I like to be pragmatic, because these case studies elucidate the point that we're trying to make. Look at Ghana, for example. When the diaspora was welcome and they open up what I call dual citizen. You can be a citizen of a Western country and she is a citizen of Ghana at the same time. These people became not just politically active in the economy of the sector. When the crisis that hit Ghana started, these people became a channel which the government used in order to win itself of the economic crisis that Ghana went through. So these diaspora that I talked about, diaspora is a gold mine that the African continent can harvest. The African continent should not be hostile, because there are some countries like yours in Cameroon where you are, they're so hostile to the diaspora. There have been a bill that has been tabled that should give the diaspora dual citizenship. There's been debate over it. But what is hindering them from tabling that bill and making sure that bill can pass? Because of this fear that the diaspora would influence the election positively, not negatively. That's the fear. That's what it is. There's no other way to look at it. Otherwise, why would you not welcome your own children? That some of them, even government, spend money on them, send them on scholarship, postgraduate studies, and so on and so forth. And then you tell them that once they settle in those countries and get citizenship or whatever stay in that country, they're no more welcome back home. Do you know how weird that sounds? Because this is people that have invested in their country, people that have, the government is sort of invested in them, but they are now told they are not welcome back. You are not a citizen of this country anymore. It sounds so odd and so weird and so repulsive. So the diaspora has a significant role to play in the development of our country. And countries that have welcomed them, welcomed their own children, welcomed their own people back home, they have seen the enormous transformation of those countries. But the ones that are hostile, pick one that's hostile to diaspora and see the consequences of that country. So yeah, the diaspora has a great role to play, whether it's economical, whether it's political, whether it's transfer of technology. I'll give you an example. You're in Cameroon, so let me take Cameroon for example. We had a colleague, he's an engineer, went to school in Germany. When he went to school in Germany, after finishing studies, he came to Cameroon to establish an engineering consulting and production company. I can't remember the area where he wanted to specialize in. When he came to Cameroon, he applied for a license to start a business. Guess what? It took him 6 months to even get a response, and the response was not even positive because, according to Cameroon law, he was already a German citizen. Therefore, they were treating him now as a foreigner. He couldn't start that business. Now, what happened? He left Cameroon and went to Botswana. Botswana welcomed him. If you look at the massive industry company he started over there, massive production of parts, spare parts for company, for motors and all whatnot. That is an example of what I'm telling you. Countries that are hostile to diaspora, whether it comes to political issues like we're discussing the power of the ballot box, or it comes to the economic issues like I just mentioned, they pay a price. And the ones that welcome their own diaspora, they benefit of the outcome. Because this young man is a Cameroonian. He's now stationed in Botswana. Imagine the transfer of technology between Germany and Botswana that he's bringing. He's bringing technical expertise, transfer of technology. He's bringing his colleagues who are Germans to come and help him out in terms of installing the initial installation and training Botswanans, people from Botswana, to run that company for him. And he's now producing and exporting in mostly Southern African countries. Who has lost? Is it Cameroon and Germany? Of course, Cameroon. So those are examples of things that we see. Countries that are hostile to the diaspora, they are on the losing side and not on the winning side.
Exactly. Sometimes just the policies was hindering progress in the countries. But then you earlier on cited a lot of powerful points, which I would like to focus on. Now, the fact that we have free and fair elections does not necessarily guarantee that we shall have good governance in the country. But looking at the political landscape across the African continent, why is that so?
Let me differ a little bit with you, Sharon. The fact that if we have good elections, free and fair elections, yes, it is true that it does not guarantee good governance. But what it guarantees is that it guarantees that people are able to hold those people accountable. The people that voted for them are able to hold them accountable if they fail. But if you do not have free and fair elections, those who are in power are not accountable to anybody. They do not represent anybody. They can do anything, they can do undo, they can do anything, they can completely decimate the country, and nobody's going to do anything about it because they have not been put there by the people. But a country where people have actually been voted into power and the elections were free and fair, that means if they do not produce the results, that means if something happens along the way, because a country that functions normally, in a representative democracy, what happens is that along the way, sometimes you have midterm elections, sometimes you have end of year elections. If there are midterm elections like council elections or parliamentary elections, people will judge the party that won that election during that time. And they'll say, you know what? We gave you the power. You haven't delivered. We're voting you out. That's how democracy works. So again, yes, free and fair election does not necessarily guarantee that it will be good governance, but it guarantees that the people that are in power are easily held responsible, accountable, and they can, be forced out of power at any time. So that's the advantage of free and fair elections.
Okay, so in your opinion, what are some of the challenges associated with the electoral processes across the African continent?
They are numerous. They are numerous. I don't think you have the time for us to go through it, but let me tell you, I already mentioned a few of them. If you look at the onset of the configuration of the electoral bodies, that is a problem there, number one. If you look at the voter disenfranchisement in terms of voter apathy, country like where you are, go on the streets and ask people, why are you not registering to vote? Why are you not interested in this? What are they going to tell you? Oh, whether I vote or I don't vote, nothing's going to change. That's what people are going to tell you. Why? Because they have been so disenfranchised to a point where they don't see anything changing. Who does that? It's not the political parties that are trying to be in power. It's the government, it's the party in power that does that because they want to remain sit-tight for centuries. They don't want to leave. Number three, if you look at the composition, like I said before, the composition of the electoral bodies in Africa, those are by themselves problematic because if you stock an electoral body with members of a single political party, that's already representing unfairness. Number five, if you look at, what we call in political science, I'm not a political scientist, but I do read a little bit of it, it said, politics of poverty. What's the politics of poverty? You disfranchise people in such a way that if you now come back and give them a few bags of rice, a cup of salt or dairy, they're going to sing praises unto you and make you feel that you're like you're gone. But this is somebody that you've taken away his political right, you've taken away his future, you now go with peanuts and give him peanuts and ask him to vote for you, and he's singing praises unto you as if you've become a god. So a lot of this is happening in Africa. So how do we go about this? Number one, if the electoral process can be revamped, if people can push to have an independent electoral body, whether you call it commission or LECAM in Gabon or NPR in Nigeria or whatever it is, whatever country, doesn't really matter. It should be independent. Citizens should push for that. Number two, discourage tribal voting. Because that's what these oligarchs do. What they do is that they'll bring somebody from a particular tribe, and he will go there and tell his people that if you vote for X, Y, and Z, he's going to come there, and the people from that region, they're going to be the ones that are going to enjoy all the goods and goodies. No. people should be wise to understand that that's the language of a political oligarch. Because I'll take the case of Cameroon where you are. What the people of the northwest province of Cameroon are suffering, with the exception of the war, is the same poverty the people of Ebola are suffering. It's the same suffering that the people of Ngaoundere are going through. It's the same problem that the people of Douala are going through. So it doesn't matter whether the politician that is in power comes from A or B or Z, everyone is going to suffer the same fate. Everyone is going to suffer the same fate. So don't go out there and vote for someone because it comes from your tribe or from your region. Vote for who is going to change the country. When there's economic crisis in the country, it affects everybody across the board. When there is, when the government is taking the money that is supposed to be doing development in the country and they're servicing the debt of foreign countries, it affects everybody in the country. So any ills that happen to that country affects everybody across the board, whether the person comes from tribe A or tribe B. So African people should understand what it means by representative democracy. And when they do that, they'll push for the right thing and they'll have representative democracy. So time of famine will go through a litany of lists of what they need to do. But again, even if, let me say this here, even if you have an oligarch, a dictator, and someone that does not want to leave power, still register to vote. Go out there and register and vote, because when people come out massively, yes, they'll be fraud, but there's a certain level to which they can go. So keep pushing. Don't let voter apathy or disenfranchisement make you say, oh, if I go out there and vote, nothing's going to change. Register and vote, and in mass, and things will start changing. Even if it might take years, but things will start changing. But the more you sit back, people sit back and say, if I don't register, if I vote or I don't vote, nothing's going to change. Somebody's going to be there, definitely. And who's going to be there? People of the sit-tight government in place will continue to plunder the country because they see that they have won. They have made you to sit back and given up, and you have given up. So please register and vote.
Africans should register and vote if they want change to come to them. Now, speaking of the ballot box, how could it reshape democracy or the perception of democracy that already exists on the African continent?
How can the power of the ballot box reshape the perception of the continent?
Of democracy.
Of democracy. Okay, of course. Whoever knew that people like, what do you call, Mobutu Sese Seko can ever leave power? Whoever knew that Alfred Boigny can ever leave power? Whoever knew that in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak will ever be deposed? So when we talk of democracy here, it's true that we are talking about the power of the ballot box. We also talk about the power of people to speak up. That's also democracy. Speak up, including the media like yours. Let the media be the ones to also speak up on the ills in the society. If the media is there to sing the praises of the government, the media is also participating in the ills that are happening in Africa. We need media that can speak up and say, bring people on the table and let people dissect the problem that's happening in the country and say, this cannot go on. Not only that, if you look at what democracy has done to countries like South Africa and the ability to speak up, black South Africans did not have the power to vote. But because of continuous speaking up in one way or the other, albeit peaceful, we advocate for peaceful speaking up, though. We're not talking about people, destroying properties and destroying human lives and so on. No, we are talking about speaking up peacefully. Because the more you sit silent, the more they said that evil increases when good people stay quiet. That's what they always say. So through the power of the ballot box, people should speak. People should advocate for change. Political parties should advocate for change. You don't wait until, election day, and then you go up your campaigning. Political parties need to go out there and talk to the people, make their points, agenda, and the platform. Because what is happening in Africa, because of this issue we're discussing about, Sharon, is that sometimes elections is coming and you don't know what any political party is standing for. What is their manifesto? What do they want to do if you give them power? They will ramble a few points here and everybody will be running behind back of rights and so on. But with the power of the ballot box, when people demand and ask, debate, for example, on TV, take political parties, every political party, and say, if you're a political party leader and you are going out there to vote, you must be present on a debate, like what we see in the West. Talk about your platform, talk about your agenda. Let people vote based on what you are promising, what you want to do. Not some political party and said, oh, I am this, I am that, I am this, vote for me because I have the experience. Experience to do what? If you've been there, tell us what you've done all that time. Tell the people of Africa what you've been able to do all that time. So there should be, number one, openness. There should be two, advocacy. Advocacy is not just political parties going for election. Advocacy is standing up and talking about what's the ills in the society and asking people to voice their opinion. Let them speak up. And that is another problem there, that when people speak up and they're being brutalized, they're being jailed, they're being arrested, it gives a bad image to Africa. It gives a bad image, even from a business perspective. If you're a businessman in the West here, monitoring, you want to go and invest in Nigeria, Cameroon, Central African Republic, and so on, what are you doing? You are monitoring the election. This is what people are not aware of. All those stakeholders, NGOs, they monitor the elections that are happening in that country. And once they see that the results either became a battleground after the results where people were fighting, political instability, there's chaos, it already bars the road for investors. It is termed a risky environment. Nobody wants to go there and invest. Who suffers? Everybody suffers. So the ballot box, yes, this is what we are talking about, but it goes beyond just voting. The consequences of the fair elections, positive or negative, carries a great toll on the population of a country. So this is something I keep on saying, media in Africa need to take its place and be talking about it so that the powers that be can listen.
Speaking of the role of the media today, media personnel are celebrating the World Press Freedom Day, a time for them to be able to reflect on how objective they can be in terms of their reporting. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just tuning in, you are on to Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa, where today we're discussing the power of the ballot box in reshaping the future of the African continent. Like you've noticed, we're joined by Dr. Elijah ENOAKU, who is the director of the Center for Africa Development. Back to you, Dr. Elijah. The ballot box has the power to impact the country's overall development, as you mentioned in your previous analysis, as well as the country's governance systems. Now, with all this in mind, being the director of the Center for Africa Development, how do you analyze this aspect of how powerful the ballot box can be in terms of reshaping a country's future?
So let me talk about, since you asked me a question relating to our center, let's discuss some of the things that our center is working on right now. We work on conflict resolution as well. We are not directly involved in negotiation, but we give data to a lot of organizations that are working in conflict, in countries with conflict. We work with countries that are undergoing a transition. We work with countries that are trying to move from a one system to the other, like a country that is going from a presidential system to a parliamentary system. We work with countries that are going through economic crisis. We work with countries, we work basically every country. But when it comes to this particular issue of the ballot box, what we've realized is that a lot of these countries, let me not say a lot, a good number of these countries have the political will to effect a change, but they are being hampered by a few, I call them oligarchs, a few oligarchs that do not want a change. And they are utilizing not just people in Africa, people in the Western world where I find myself also involved. I was on air with a member of a political party from Zambia, and it was on your program. I mean, not on your TV station, a sister TV station. And we're talking about the sponsorship of elections in Africa by Western bodies that are sponsoring elections in Africa. And this gentleman on air admitted having been contacted by a Western organization for support, that they were going to pump in millions of dollars into his campaign under the condition that if he won, he was going to give them mineral rights. Now, why do I bring this point? I bring this point because these are some of the things our organization is going to pinpoint as well. That when you do not have independence in your electoral processes, when you don't have laws that prohibit the sponsoring of elections in your country, sovereignty is already at stake. Because imagine that young man, if he accepted that, because he told us on air that he actually rejected that. Imagine that that young man accepted that amount of money, and imagine that he won. Who do you think is going to be calling the shots when it comes to the mineral rights of Zambia? Of course, the Western world. Of course, these Western organizations. So it has huge implications when it comes to the power of ballot box and making sure that that power is not taken over by anybody. So we work with organizations as well to present data on the country statistic, what has been happening there in terms of helping countries in free and fair elections. This is an area where we have not dabbled into because this is very, very tricky, and countries that open up to our organization in terms of help, if they need help, we will gladly supply some of our representatives. We have representatives almost in so far, I would say 7 countries in Africa. We're still growing, the young organizations. We will work with them, give them our representative who will help them in terms of fostering, democracy in that country. Tell them the pitfalls, give them data on what it means, what the United Nations Development Organization is looking for, what the Bretton Woods Institution is looking for, what those NGOs are looking for, what multinationals are looking for in terms of free and fair elections. We'll present them with that data. What they do with that data is up to them. When it comes to a research center, you can influence, but we do give them that data. They know the consequences of a unfair elections. They know the consequences of rioting. They know the consequences of bad governance. They know the consequences of war that we've been talking about over the years. They know the consequences of all these things, but are they ready? As I told you from the beginning, are the governments in Africa ready for a change? That's what the problem is. It's not that they don't have the data. They have the data. They have people telling them. But because you have a few people holding the continent of Africa hostage, that's where we find ourselves where we are, where the ballot box has been taken hostage, and you have all these sham elections going across the continent of Africa, and they call them representative democracy. It's anything close to that that's happening in most of these countries. But we have good ones. You have countries like Botswana that they have transparent electoral boxes, elections are counted on that day. Every representative of the political party has a list, and the list that is, enumerated and added together by the electoral body has to match every single list that was represented by those countries. Kenya is coming up as well, even though they have few problems with their own system. Nigeria, somewhere in the middle there. Senegal has gone up because they are organizations that rank those countries in terms of democratic index. Senegal has come up very far. There are a few countries there, but majority of countries in Africa rank very poorly when it comes to democracy index. Very, very poor. The number one reason is the ballot box that we are talking about here.
Exactly. Everything revolves around the ballot box. Now, speaking of this issue of sponsorship from Western organizations, and now in terms of electoral processes, how does this further go to discredit the entire electoral process?
It's a scheme. Let me explain to you how it works. You have an organization in the West. It could be the Western Industrial Complex, like what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You have an organization that's existing in the West. They are either exploiting minerals in Africa, they know the routes, they know the people in Africa, they have their insiders in Africa. So what happens when elections coming, they start lobbying. They have lobbyists all over. People that will lobby and lobby and lobby and present data that is favorable to say, vote for this candidate, or don't do this, or don't do that, because they have an agenda behind. And what Africa should do is what a lot of Western countries are already doing. Completely banned the sponsoring of elections in Africa by foreign bodies. It should be a no-go area. It should be completely banned. Number two, every candidate in elections is supposed to represent, prove the source of their funding, because that's another black box. If you look at what is happening in Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, where the rebels are, you have rebels. I mentioned this in one of the TV interview where I was invited. You have rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo that have helicopter gunships. Where do rebels get helicopter gunships from? Of course, from the West. They have sponsors from the West. And when elections are coming, they have people that are going to put in place and say, vote for this, vote for this. And because of, I would say, I wouldn't blame our people, poverty. When they give you a bag of rice, that's somebody that's been living without food for months. Is going to take that rice, is going to stuff the electoral boxes and say that candidate A or candidate B has won. But at the end of the day, he's going to eat that bag of rice for 1 week and it's going to be poor again. And the politician will be gone. He'll be nowhere to be seen. He will wait for another 5 years to come with another bag of rice to give people. So that's what I call politics of poverty. Let the people be impoverished, and then you throw them peanuts, and then they will say they have voted for you, and then you stop the electoral boxes, and then say you have won. So that is the scheme that's happening. That is the scheme that's happening in the West here. You have these puppet leaders who do not represent the interest of the people, but they represent the interest of some corporate organization in the West. And when they represent that corporate organization interest of the West, like I said before, it comes at a cost. Mineral rights, contracts. Because if you see in many countries in Africa, you see a few Western organizations that are winning a lot of contracts, road contracts, school constructions, airports. You find a few, I don't want to call names, you're in Cameroon, you can testify to what I'm saying. A few of them. Does it mean that there's not competition in bidding of contract in that country? No. What it means is that you have those NGOs and those countries that have infiltrated themselves into those countries, and they're influencing the leaders in order to get those contracts. They are actually ruling that country. That's what we call them, puppet leaders. They don't represent the interests of the people. They represent the interests of some Western organization, because when elections are coming, that is how they manipulate themselves to make sure that those leaders that are favorable to their interests continue to remain in power, either through the battle or through the gun. They will get that done.
How can, or what measures could be put in place to revamp the already old and overdue electoral processes that exist, to bring in ones that reflect or could portray the development of respective nations?
Okay, I already gave you a couple of them. I said when it comes to Western organizations, for example, that should be banned. That should be a no-go area. Number two, when it comes to the national organizations or bodies that are taking care of elections in Africa, what needs to be done these days? Political parties need to push for representative bodies. Representative bodies will come in here. They will be acting in good faith because they neither represent Party A or Party B or Party C. They represent the aspirations of the people. Number three, all political parties will now have their own representatives as members of this body. As members of this body. And number four, these organizations should have an independent budget that they are going to use. That budget has to be supplied by the state. That they're going to use in what? Sensitization. Voter registration, making sure that the material that they're going to be using for voter registration goes out there on time, making sure that all registration and polling stations, for example, are published. You do not have polling stations in funds palace, in people's backyard, in people's the DO's office, or in this place and so on. Those things are transparent for everybody to see. That goes to the credibility of the elections. Because if I see that you have transparent electoral bodies with transparent electoral boxes and everybody is voting and every political party has the results and the result that is tabled by the electoral body corresponds with the result that came out from the polling station, that is what we call credibility of elections. That is going to encourage people to go and vote because everybody will know their votes count. And they will now know that these people can be accountable for what they do when they are in power. Number five, you're going to understand that people that will now be vying for elective offices, they are aware that they are not going to cheat their way to the top. What are they going to do? They are going to go into every nook and cranny to get the vote of the people. Because what's happening in Africa is that you have somebody who sits in office, running for elections. He goes and visits maybe the major towns. For example, you're in Cameroon, you visit Douala. They will visit Bamenda, they might visit Boya, and visit Yaoundé, and goes back. And then he's declared as a winner in Maiduguri. He's declared as a winner in Bengui. He's declared as a winner in Widikum. He's declared as a winner in Jikwa. He's declared as a winner in Babongo. He's declared as a winner in Kambe. He's declared as a winner in Kom Fundong. But he never stepped his leg in any of those places. How did that happen? He will tell you that he has a representative there. But this is what we say, voting is not by proxy. Campaigns, people need to hear your manifesto. People were voting without even knowing, what does this party represent? Because when it comes to elections, every place has its own objectives. The Northwest, for example, has its own objective. A lot of people in the Northwest and Southwest, they want the war to end in Cameroon. Everybody wants peace. But you have politicians who do not represent the aspiration of the people saying they have won in the Northwest and the Southwest. How did that happen? Did the Northwest and the Southwest people vote against the aspiration? Did they vote against what they don't want? That tells you that that is an election that was staged from somewhere else. And people need to be talking about these things freely without fear or favor. That's what we are advocating for. And that is what an electoral body that represents aspiration of the people needs to advocate for. And when it comes to an election, and sometimes there might not be free an election, look at what happened in Kenya. You will have a constituted election body, or it could be the Supreme Court, it could be the council, electoral council, constitutional council, for the case of countries like Cameroon and other French countries. That should be able to say, the election in this place did not go on well. They have the power to cancel it and let it be rerun. Fair. But when those checks and balances are not put in place, again, it undermines the credibility of elections in Africa. And it's not good for Africa at all.
Exactly. So we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Point. So now, in a bid to contribute towards credible elections across the African continent, Dr. Elijah, where does digital technology actually come into play?
Oh, technology is very, very important. But again, if you're talking about technology, you have to talk about the political power, willpower to implement such technology.
Absolutely.
The reason that oligarchs and political sit-tight leadership does not want any form of technology is because it's going to expose them. Imagine that you have elections where you have cameras at the polling station. It's going to expose them. You have elections where there's internet. Why do you think that when elections are coming in most African countries, the internet is cut off? They're afraid that people are going to be exposing the fraud or the massive fraud that's taking place or might be taking place. So technology is something that can play a vital role. But the question is, with the current electoral bodies that we have in Africa, are they willing to implement technology in terms of electoral bodies? We have technology in African countries, for example, Botswana. I'm telling you that in Botswana, when elections are taking place, it's so transparent in a way that before the end of the day, results are announced, just like you have here in the Western world. Not because, there are planes flying all over the place and collecting the ballot boxes and then bringing it to the Electoral Commission. It's because they use technology, they're well connected. The results are announced and collected. Everybody signs onto it. They put it through the machines. It goes straight to electoral body, and they are collected and they are compared with what came out from the field and reported on the same day. So the problem with technology is the leadership that is afraid of transparency. Otherwise, it can all be implemented across Africa.
Exactly. Let's wrap up today's edition. Could you give your closing remarks before we wrap up today's edition?
My closing remark is for the young people. Please register, go out and vote. It could be a corrupt system. It could be a fair system. It could be an average system. But the more people vote, the less the cheating could be. But the fewer people vote, the more the fraud will be. So whether it is Cameroon or Chad or these other countries that are coming, or Madagascar, or countries that are having elections this year or next year, please, young people, particularly, I say young people because that's where voter apathy has been all along in Africa. Young people not wanting to participate in democracy. So I'm encouraging you, go out there, look for where the electoral body is conducting registration, register, and go out and vote.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah ENOAKU, the Director of the Center for African Development, for your contribution on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thanks for having me, Sharon.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we conclude this edition, or weekend edition of the program over your Pan-African channel. Thank you for watching. To stay in company of our numerous programs.